Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, 10 Years On, Contesting Cyberspace in the Middle East and North Africa, hosted by the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP for short. My name is Maysa Adeni, and I'm the Institute's Managing Director, as well as its Legal and Judicial Director. Digital tools and tactics played a key role in the region's 2010 and 2011 uprisings. In the decades since, the digital space has evolved dramatically, serving both as a platform to mobilize change, but also as a mechanism of suppression. For the next hour and a half, we are absolutely privileged to be joined by a remarkable panel of advocates and experts who will explore what the space to organize online looks like today, 10 years later, taking themes like censorship, cyber surveillance, misinformation, privacy, others into account. You can join the conversation online using the hashtag 10YearsOn, and this event will be recorded and we'll be sure to share the video shortly after. It is my honor to introduce today's moderator for the event, David Kaye. David is a clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. If you haven't already, and on a personal note, I highly recommend his book, which touches on many of the themes we'll discuss today, Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet. David, the floor is yours.
Great. May, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for including me in this panel. We have really a remarkable panel, and I'm sure that we'll be using up every minute of our hour and a half that we have together. I want to start by just putting this a little bit in context, and by perhaps giving us a little bit of a tone to start, and then I'll introduce our panelists and ask them each a general question to get us started. You know, obviously 10 years after the beginning of the Arab Spring, a little more than 10 years, of course, after the Arab Spring, you know, it's easy to look back on that time with perhaps some regret, some cynicism even. You know, it was a moment in which I think people around the world saw the use of technology as a tool of peaceful protest, of organizing, of democratization, of the sharing of information, of so much. I think our panelists here today also, from the very earliest days, saw the dark underside of that. And we saw that in Tahrir Square itself, when the government made demands of telcos to shut down. It wasn't just a story of Twitter or Facebook or YouTube providing access to information. That sort of dark side was at the beginning too. I think clearly our understanding of the role of technology, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa today, has changed significantly, because we've seen repeated government attacks on freedom of expression through the use of technology, whether it's surveillance or it's the targeting of individuals in dissent, the targeting of human rights activists, of journalists, and many others. And so this is a particularly important time, a time of global pandemic, a time of transition, for us to be thinking through some of these issues, to be reflecting back on the last 10 years, and also to be thinking forward. And we honestly could not have a better group of individuals to talk both in terms of sort of looking back, but also looking forward, because I know that all four of our panelists are remarkable experts in this space, and can really speak not only to the past, but to kind of a positive vision of the future. And so let me introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to turn to each of them. And I could spend quite a long time on the intros, because they've all done so much. Let me start with Wafa Ben-Hassine. Wafa is a New York attorney. She specializes in international law and technology. She's currently a principal on the responsible technology team at the Omidyar Network. Previously, she was the Middle East and North Africa policy manager for Access Now, co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Human Rights and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and she currently sits on the GFC on data policy. It's great to see you, Wafa. Khadeja Ramali is an independent social media researcher with an interest in the intersection of online spaces, culture, and political discourse. Khadeja's work focuses on Arabic language online spaces and foreign interference campaigns in the Middle East and North Africa. It's great to see you also, Khadeja. Ramy Raoof is a technologist and privacy researcher, and his recent work is focused on researching targeted digital attacks against human rights defenders and NGOs, and developing digital security protocols and capacity building with activists in the Middle East around surveillance and censorship. Ramy is tactical technologist at Amnesty International Security Lab. He also sits on the Tor Project's board of directors. And prior to joining Amnesty, he served as senior technologist at the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, EIPR. And he's got numerous awards, too many for me to recount here. Ramy, great to see you also. And finally, last but not least, Noura Aljizawi. Noura is a researcher at the Citizen Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. She focuses her research on the intersection of information and communication technology, human rights, and global security, with a specific focus on the MENA region. So Wafa, Noura, Ramy, Khadeja, great to see you here. I want us to start with a kind of open-ended question and give you a little bit of time to kind of situate yourself and the work that you've been doing in the panel's topic, which is 10 years after. And let me start with you, Wafa, by asking this general question. I'll ask the same question for everyone, which is, given the last 10 years, what are your most serious concerns when it comes to the digital environment, whether it's the use of digital technology for useful, valuable democratic purposes, or for the purposes that we've seen from governments in terms of their ongoing restrictions and surveillance of activism, journalism, and so forth?
Thank you, David, and hello to my fellow panelists and to our audience viewing from afar. I would say on the whole, well, a lot has happened in the past 10 years, over 10 years. But we can say that in the region, social media use has become a lot more prevalent and ubiquitous. And also what was used as a tool back then is now being used more as a space for socializing, for engaging in even business-like transactions, buying, selling, etc. And we also see that after the 2010-2011 uprisings, human rights advocates lost the so-called first mover advantage, so to speak. They're no longer taking anyone by surprise by transforming online campaigning into bodies on the street. Additionally, back then, local mainstream media and privately owned businesses, media businesses and newspapers enjoyed far more of a margin to publish from the blogs, which gave activists at the time a much wider audience as well. Today, we see that governmental authorities are really onto how activists use the internet to organize movements. In a majority of the region, the information that activists share online oftentimes is going directly to state security services. And activists sometimes still do take that risk. But stepping back, though, I think contextually it's important to understand that the contrasting political paths that each of the region's countries took obviously reflected on how the internet is used today in those respective countries. We see ever more clearly now that the internet does have its contradictory facets. It has necessary limitations, but it also has dangers, especially when it's used as a counter tool by those in power. By, for example, when they spread propaganda and false information that is intended to destabilize or distract activists, or engaging in technical infiltration. So for instance, in Egypt in 2016, we saw the Nile fish campaign, which one of my fellow panelists will cover later as well. This campaign was uncovered by Citizen Lab, where authorities sent personalized messages to targeted members of civil society and tricked recipients into clicking a link to view the file of a circulating statement, ostensibly. Almost all of the phishing emails identified by Citizen Lab were sent to individuals that were then implicated in what we call Case 173, which is otherwise known as the foreign funding case. They were either named as defendants or staff of targeted NGOs. And in contrast, when we look at Tunisia, the relative safety of the online space, and I emphasize on the word relative, at least from the governmental side of interference and encroachment, allows social advocates, human rights activists, and members of civil society generally to continue to use the same tools that they use in the uprisings to organize protests, talks, or other strategic gatherings. For example, the latest socioeconomic demonstrations in the country launched to protest austerity measures and economic uncertainty relied heavily on Facebook to communicate messages about meeting points to the public, articulate demands to the government, and as well as issue press statements to the public. While hundreds of protesters were arrested in the demonstrations, the path leading to their arrest was not, or detention was not based on critical speech or catalyzing online activity, nor was it through a monitoring of activism using technological tools. Rather, it was through on-the-ground arrests that were typically preluded by police brutality. And just to close, I think, as my fellow panelists will later go into as well, each country is different. It's important to emphasize that. But what does remain is that while the internet and communication services are essential tools in our world today, the truly vital resources are collective energy and commitment to campaigning and change. And as authorities in the region continue to assault the open internet, committed social movement activists today will adapt and are adapting.
Great, Wafa, thanks so much. Khadeja, Wafa mentioned, disinformation and a range of other concerns. Are those the kinds of concerns that you've seen? I know you've also spent a particular amount of time looking at situations, for example, in Libya. What do you see in terms of the greatest concerns with respect to technology and the assault on rights?
Yeah, so continuing on from Wafa's comments and remarks on this, starting off, like I've seen us kind of travel a really long path from 2011 till 2021 today, where the region and Libyans overall started using the internet to express themselves, to basically start news outlets and magazines and newspapers, to use it as a tool to express what they've been living through for 40 odd years. And then having that move on to kind of like throughout the years, being a tool used by conflict actors. Libya is an active conflict zone, which originally started out as being domestic conflict that then got out of control to being a proxy war situation that leaked into the online world as well as the offline world. And at the beginning of this situation, like there wasn't really much attention on the online disinformation that was being used by different conflict actors. It was just seen as a side effect of the war. It wasn't seen as something that could have any effect on the actual actors on the ground. It wasn't until I'd say 2 years ago or until April 2019 where we start to see Gulf actors, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, but also Turkey, Qatar, kind of like start to use the online space to further their own kind of like foreign agendas with regards to their interests in North Africa and Libya specifically, to try to kind of like alter offline events. And I don't think we've seen that in the North Africa space before. And Libya is kind of like that case study where everything goes wrong all at once while you have a conflict. So disinformation didn't actually just play a threat, but it actually influenced offline events where you had actors being polished in front of the international community that could then influence kind of like peace agreements, peace deals, where diplomats didn't have access to offline spaces, but they could only see online. So they could only see what is called potentially like an astroturfing campaign, which wasn't really identified as an astroturfing campaign. So they would think, oh, the Libyans support this party over another. And I think it's just kind of like a really strong and significant case for how do we deal with disinformation actors influencing a ceasefire? How do we deal with disinformation actors influencing peace agreements, which we saw in November 2020 with kind of like Russia interfering in the Libyan peace agreements, but we had kind of like swift action from Facebook and the UN at that time, which was a lucky occurrence, because usually you don't have the resources and capacity from people on the ground to catch these things quickly. And I think for me, one of the biggest risks is we went from listening to people on the ground expressing themselves to going to a situation where you can't see organic voices, or you can't tell the difference between an organic voice and somebody sitting in Saudi Arabia or somebody sitting in Egypt, kind of pretending to be an organic voice through these outsourced companies. But yeah, I'll just stop there. And that disinformation has real world consequences, especially in conflict zones.
Yeah, I'm going to want to come back to this issue of organic voices and how we deal with that, how you see activists dealing with that, how you see the companies dealing with that. I'm going to return to that because I think that's a real central issue that clearly is not just a MENA issue, but is a global one as well. Let me turn to Ramy. Ramy, you've been sort of deeply involved in all of these issues as well for, more than 10 years. And at the level of both infrastructure and security and activism, how do you reflect on the current moment that we're in?
Thank you, David, and thank you to Tahrir Institute. I think my observations looking backwards on the past 10 years, there are a few things I would share. One is across North Africa, and particularly also in Egypt, the militarization process have took a strong hit on all public and private spaces, and the military grip on different domains such as education, medication, ICT, telecom, everything had a strong impact on people's ability to practice various rights, to organize, to access information. This also brings us to the infrastructure ownership across North Africa, enables the adversary to engage in a wide variety of experiments around network interference and censorship and surveillance. We have seen in Jordan, Sudan, and Egypt an increased blocking activity of websites, web content, digital content over the past 3 or 4 years. We have also seen different experiments that some states have been trying to deploy to target certain tools and platforms that are known among the democratic bloc or the human rights bloc that people are using it, such as Tor or Signal or other softwares. Another observation also from security point of view is there's an increased dependency on outsourcing cyber attacks against NGOs to companies and contractors. Instead of states deploying attacks in-house, they are now outsourcing it to companies and private contractors. This is also being easier because the European Union safeguards around the import and export of dual-use technologies is really poor, which enables a variety of attacks to be taking place. At the same time, over the past 10 years, the average knowledge among the people when it comes to safety and security has increased a lot. It's not the same like from 10 years ago. Certain topics and tools that might have been a niche tool or among certain people are now much more common knowledge. So when we talk about encryption or security or privacy, it's not anymore a limited conversation, and we have more people into this conversation and into this practice. And the more the states develop their techniques to control people, eventually people become more creative in how they can organize and how they can maneuver around this, even if there are different limitations. But definitely people's ability to organize is gaining a different edge over the past 5 years.
Great, thank you, Ramy. So this is sort of a nice segue to Noura, who, because Noura, you've been focusing on all of these issues, in particular surveillance and those kinds of attacks and the kinds of issues that you and your colleagues at Citizen Lab focus on. And I know you've spent particular time thinking about Syria, as many of us have. What are your reflections here?
Thanks, David, and thanks for Tahrir for having me. Honestly, since the other panelists have just focused on the what's going on in the region, I try, and also it's a part of my ongoing research with the Citizen Lab. We are studying the transnational digital repression, which is like, we believe that it's a part of the expand repression conducted by the authoritarian regimes in the region. The transnational digital repression is not like just a new phenomenon. It's however, the digital surveillance technology created a new order of transnational repression and empowered the authoritarian regimes to expand their repression operations, not only going after the activists and dissidents domestically, but also expanding the repression operations over the exile. I believe that on one hand, the changing dynamics of the Arab Spring, as you said, but in some countries we've been observing some kind of regret or another like changing in the dynamics of the mobilization, including Syria and definitely the other states. However, I think the power of the activism and the expanded activism to keep going forward in the democratic change in the region have been moved and transformed to the exile, and the power of the work now has been done through the diaspora communities, and now we've been observing the efforts of the transnational advocacy. The research and technical reports demonstrate a wide range of digital repression tools, like a wide range between the most traditional tools like social media monitoring, cyberbullying, phishing, and more sophisticated tools of commercial spyware, such as Pegasus by NSO, FinSpy by Gamma Group, and FinFisher, and others. These attacks targeted activists, whether from the Arab Spring states, in order to repress them and to silence them and to restrain their efforts. They started in 2010 and 2011, or also to prevent any other potential opportunities of uprising in the other states like Morocco, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. And here I want to actually highlight on the impacts of these threats, not only on the targeted individuals themselves, but also on the potential risk they might be put on. Whether targeting and revealing their networks, secret networks of activists and associated colleagues back home, the impact of their activism and their efforts of conducting the advocacy to their countries, also their ability to resettle in the new communities. I'm talking here in particular about the refugees, and also about the diaspora communities. And unfortunately, the last couple of years, with the tragic assassination of Jamal Khashoggi and the hacking of Omar Abdulaziz's phone, the report was uncovered by Citizen Lab, and afterward, the other means of harming and targeting Omar physically in Canada, and also alongside with the other, so the activists. I think it should be like a warning to all of us to the critical risk of transnational digital threats, additionally to the responsibility of the hosting states, which is something like not had been talking about a lot, and moreover about the how we need to keep moving forward in the advocacy. I know, David, you've been working so hard on the how to regulate the work and how to create these like manners or global manner of the export of the digital surveillance technology to the authoritarian regimes. I think there's a lot to be talk about, but I'd like to like have more discussion more than just giving my my testimony.
No, this was great, Noura, and so there's several different paths here that I want us to go down in order to explore some of the different themes that you've all been raising. Before I do that, I just want to say to all the participants, please feel free to submit questions using the question box on the side. This GoToWebinar might be new to some of you. I think it was new to all 5 of us. So we're getting used to it too, but please submit a question. I'm sure that you have questions, whether they're directed to a particular panelist or you'd like to hear all the panelists reflect on something. Please feel free to submit your questions, and I'll present them to the panel as well. I want to, before we drill down into some of the specific areas that you've each mentioned, you've all talked about specific forms of repression that we've seen in recent years. I wonder if you could speak to the way in which law in across the MENA region has also changed, if it has. Wafa, for example, I know that you followed very closely sort of the development of new cybersecurity laws across the region, or at least laws that are framed as cybersecurity, and yet they're really not about any individual activist security. Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing on the legal side, and then if anybody else wants to jump in on that as well?
Sure, thank you, David. I think very briefly, the law has always been in service of those in power a lot of times, whether it's a law against use of drugs or whether it's a law against protesting. Oftentimes it goes down to arresting certain types of speech and silencing it and repressing it. And so when we talk specifically about digitally linked legislation, we see a lot of cybercrime laws that have really truly nothing to do with cybercrime. A great example of this was the one passed in Egypt a few years ago too. And across the region generally, we saw this trend starting about maybe, I would say 4 years ago, 4 to 3 years ago, where as soon as the word fake news started to be used in the global context, a lot of legislators in the region and governmental authorities started to take to that as a wonderful justification to silence speech. And those types of fake news laws, and I use air quotes because that's not how we call it anymore, but have been included in legislation such as cybersecurity laws. And again, like if these were truly cybersecurity intended laws, then they would protect users instead of putting them at risk. And what we see instead is that these types of laws give a wide margin for authorities to be able to attack activists, to spy on them, to take down their content, of course, working with tech companies as well. And it's obviously a very bad trend. But no matter what, I think, and this is in the case of oftentimes repressive laws. I think in the case of Tunisia in particular, I mean, Tunisia has so many laws and so much legislation. It's not always applied. Oftentimes, there's even a law that prohibits encryption. It's not really law. It's a regulation that says if you do encrypt your emails, you have to hand over your key to the government. And of course, that's not being enforced. But at the same time, other laws, such as wonderful access to information laws, are also not being enforced. And so it just really depends. But like you correctly identified, there has been the trend of using different sorts of laws to crack down on speech. And again, like it could be any kind of law, and we've seen this since before the uprising as well.
Mm-hmm. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on that? It could be, a question of not just new law that's been developed, but also the use of older laws or laws that don't necessarily have a direct application, or at least on the face of them don't apply to online space only. I'm thinking of laws that have focused on foreign funding of NGOs, for example, or laws related to terrorism that have been used against journalists and activists. To what extent have you seen the use of legal tools? So not just the police practices that have existed and pre-existed the advent of online space, but to what extent are you seeing the use of those kinds of tools as a justification for repressive activities? anybody wants to.
I can jump on that. Yeah, actually, particularly in Syria, back 2011, we didn't have any regulations to regulate or to control, to make, like, to guarantee the control of the state on the cyberspace. However, the justification of arresting people and going after them because they posted something that doesn't agree or doesn't match the state narrative was under the justification of the state of emergency law the country was under back then. Moreover, if we want to talk about the current events, I've been like following the regulations in the region, and I think that Tunisia is too much progress than the other countries. But we need also to consider the securitization of the COVID-19 pandemic and how even in the countries where they don't have state of emergency or they don't address any kind of counterterrorism regulations and emergency of state because of the counterterrorism, the tools have been coming to silence the dissidents and also the ordinary citizens just because they are posting something doesn't match the narrative of the state. The example, one of the just very simple examples is the efforts of the government of Egypt to arrest and to silence and to charge anyone who is posting something doesn't match the official narrative of state regarding the health procedures and the numbers and I don't know if anyone heard about the latest case of the shortcut of oxygen in one of the hospitals. When the guy posted the video and he was complaining about on Twitter about the death, he was documenting the death of all patients in the ICU room. He got arrested and he was charged on the spreading disinformation. So now we've been observing that the authoritarian states are taking advantage of any opportunity to securitize and to silence the citizens. Now we are not only talking about silencing the activists, the journalists, but moreover to expand the repression over all citizens. In Syria, the same. Syria has been like struggling in financial crisis a long time ago. Now, if anyone of the regime supporters would post anything on Facebook or social media, he will be arrested on charge of spreading disinformation. So now people cannot consider as Wafa said, cannot consider the cyberspace and social media to be like safe, but they take the risk because they don't have any other alternative options.
Yeah, and so that's, I mean, really interesting. Maybe I could ask you, Ramy, given what you've described and what your co-panelists have described as, you know, both the sort of the securitization of the environment and the militarization of the environment, combined with the, you know, the efforts of outside actors and internal actors to spread disinformation. For you as a technologist, how do you deal with that? What are the things, what are the tools that you suggest activists use, but maybe even, and so that's one question, but maybe even stepping back further, what are the difficulties that you find even in doing the research and advocacy in this space?
Yeah, thank you. I think different. On one hand, what Noura was also describing, it indicates how there is a direction to control any public narrative on the internet, and there is, generally speaking, an attitude of a panic response to control different narratives on different domains that people can use to slightly have a free flow of information, but the states are not happy with it, so they start cracking down in different ways. It's also important to note that the state, specifically in Egypt, for example, they are very consumed with people's personal life and people's public life, and they would like to monitor what's going on more than controlling what's going on, but they like to keep a tab on everything happening. So when we see how they are blocking websites, how they are trying to monitor Signal, how they are trying to monitor Mada Masr or BBC or any other online content, it shows us how they're obsessed with people's opinions, and it shows us how they are experimenting really hard to try to control certain elements and at the same time maintain their public image on an international level, which is a very difficult situation. It's hard to do to achieve both of them. On the other hand, publishers in Egypt, for example, either NGOs or newspapers, they are bit by bit starting to adapt to the situation and trying to become more resilient to the situation by deploying technologies that would support them to publish content and to enable people to consume this content in a free, in a kind of a free manner. And at the same time, there are some certain fights that we will always lose and we don't have an upper hand on it. So for example, when it comes to targeting ISPs, if the state decides to control, to shut down the ISP in South Sudan, for example, or to block certain content, the solutions around that are available, but they're not always easy on a mainstream level. But what happened over the past 5 years that certain knowledge, for example, like using a VPN used to be a more complicated topic from 10 years ago. Not everyone is familiar with VPN, but now if you talk with people from Syria or Bahrain or Sudan or Egypt, the idea of using a VPN is not weird anymore, is not rare anymore. It's available and happening out there, and people are becoming more aware of what's going on. It doesn't matter what specific tools people are adopting or using or the state is targeting, but the more important is that people's awareness is becoming much more higher because they can see how the state is obsessed, not only with activists or newspapers, they're obsessed with the whole country, with everyone around, professors, universities, actors, stand-up comedians. In the last 3 years, we have seen increased targeting of comedians and cartoonists, even technologists who are helping newspapers and NGOs in the region.
That's really interesting. Maybe if I could stick with you for a second, Ramy, and ask, because you mentioned ISPs, and we've got some good, really great questions already coming in, which I'm going to get to very shortly. But on the ISP question that you mentioned, maybe could you talk a little bit about the particular kinds of difficulties that are faced at the infrastructure level? So, you know, for most of the infrastructure, as you mentioned, is some of it is foreign operated, and there's licensing agreements between telcos and governments in the region, which provides a kind of like neat avenue of repression in a way. And I wonder how you see that, and whether you see pushback from any of the private actors in that space, and if not, whether it's just difficult for them to do so, and you understand that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good point. It's always important to bring up infrastructure ownership and infrastructure politics, because that's how any healthy environment could be operated through the specific pointers. In Egypt, on a physical level and on a purely technical level, all of the infrastructure is owned by the state in different ways. And the private companies, either mobile operators or ISPs, they rent the infrastructure for an annual fee, and they start operating on this basis. On the other hand, the laws that govern the relationship between the companies and the state is favoring the state power in a strong way and giving them access to a variety of things, which also means any forms of censorship and surveillance could either happen with the collaboration of the ISPs or without their interference. But what we have seen in Egypt, for example, over the past 4 years, there is an increased collaboration between the ISPs and the mobile operators and the states. And on the other hand, the ownership is moving strongly towards the state. So for example, if you look into one company like Vodafone in Egypt, Vodafone is 44.5% owned by the state. So even if there are foreign companies, but within the stock exchange, the states start buying different shares, gaining more ownership over the management, over the process, and over the rules, which give them extension power over the cell towers, infrastructure, and ISPs. We have seen the state collaborating with the Ministry of Interior at different events. When they would target a newspaper or a human rights NGO, they would they would also at the same time block their content online. So the level of syncing and collaboration of physical attack and digital attack is very impressive, and it shows that there is a strong collaboration between both of them. And regardless of the ISPs, if they are happy or not, but this is a de facto situation that we are living in. So the fact that the military is having an upper hand and the state and the companies are collaborating is not really helping us much.
Yeah, great, thanks. I want to turn to Khadeja on sort of to bring some of this together in the context of, I mean, you mentioned Libya and the issue of essentially foreign interference, and also the issue that was mentioned earlier around organic voices. What have been, from your perspective, what have been the available responses for civil society in a place like Libya, where the infrastructure has been decimated over years, the ability for people to communicate may be limited, and the ability to counter the disinformation might also be limited. What are the responses that you see? What has been the role of both government and private actors in dealing with the problems that you mentioned at the outset?
Yeah, so it's kind of like it's a big problem that civil society actors alone can't really deal with, because we went from having a relatively okay online space to having it be very toxic, filled with militia members, armed groups, different political ideologies, really monitoring what different Libyans say, especially civil society, and creating kind of like that same Gaddafi style spying on people environment, except it's like online. So civil society and activists have gone to semi-closed spaces like Facebook groups, private Facebook groups, or WhatsApp chat groups, or just closed chat groups where you can kind of authenticate whoever's in the chat group, instead of organizing or communicating in public pages where it's kind of like we say al-shara, so it's like everybody can see you. So these groups have started to become more selective with what they post online, what photos they post online, because over the years we've had several events that were popular and went viral in the civil society space. Suddenly, because they reach that virality, they catch the attention of militia members or armed groups that basically think that these things are against the values that they hold, and then you end up with these young people being arrested or held or just kidnapped or disappeared by these groups. So being viral is not really what you want if you're a civil society organization or an activist, especially like I think there was one incident where an activist was in a debate and he said something and then he ended up being held for a couple of years by one armed group. What tools do they have? It's quite disappointing and sad in that even if somebody's page kind of like gets reported by gets wrongly reported and gets like basically kicked off Facebook, they really don't have, apart from potentially the Access Now hotline to get out their voice there and raise a complaint, they really don't have many avenues to basically raise these things. It's improving now. A lot of organizations are trying to help and trying to kind of like build the capacity of locals and local organizations, but it's still quite hard because I think the laws and the regulations and policies that are in place for the Arab world and the Arab-speaking online space, they're not suited for the realities that people are living on the ground, and they're more suited for a global audience. So you have policies that were set in place for peace that don't really apply in a conflict environment. And with regards to the disinformation, I mean, fact-checking and verification only goes so far when you're dealing with foreign state actors that have huge resources in their toolkit. So you can't really put the blame on civil society actors or organizations that are mostly run by volunteers to counter a state like Russia. You really need like tech companies and like other giant lobby or parliaments, I think, to basically help you, because we have multiple governments right now, and the transition period means that these things aren't a priority for the transition government that we have in place right now, because they still see it as not really having an effect on the ground. Yeah, so the situation on the ground isn't good.
That's evident. Well, thank you very much for that. So you've raised something that I want to ask all of you to reflect on, and in part it's, and by the way, the questions coming in are fantastic, so please keep them coming. They're great. It certainly makes my job less, makes it easier, I suppose I'd say. But one of the things that you've all sort of touched on at some level is the interaction of your local environment, or the environment in any particular country or across the region, the interaction of that with multinational companies. I mean, obviously there's the American-based ones, you know, like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, but of course there's also, you know, the European telcos that Ramy had mentioned, and others. What is your sense? And this is a broad question, so you can attack it however you want. What is your sense of the relationship, and maybe the responsiveness and receptivity and activity of the foreign platforms in this space? Are they serving, like, are they alive to the concerns in the region? Are they responsive to them? If not, what are the things that you might change? And there, a question was raised about whether the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights can be a tool for us to think that through. Obviously, it's sort of a loaded question, because the answer must be yes, of course. But like, in a concrete way, what do you see in this space? Whoever would like to start first on this. I'm sure you all think about this pretty regularly.
I can say something just to start us off. I wanted, before I answer the question, I just wanted to echo what Khadeja said about the fact, and this encapsulates what has changed in the region so well since 2010. She said that, you said that going viral is not what activists want now. And I think that really says everything you have to know. It's before, going viral meant reaching a wider audience, it meant organizing, it meant acquiring new members to subscribe to different social movements, etc. And now it's the exact opposite. So, and that's kind of what I was alluding to at the beginning of my participation as well, when I mentioned that human rights advocates will be adapting. And I just wanted to thank you for that, because it really did encapsulate so much of what has changed. To answer your question, David, I think we're seeing globally that tech companies are very much concerned with, first and foremost, their bottom line and what's their profit margin. And I think that applies to every single region, and even more so in countries that do not have legislation or laws that protect human rights in a serious way, or independent authorities that overlook the sharing of data, for instance, or media authorities that actually protect the right to freedom of expression or press freedom. And so, and I'm sure the other panelists have plenty to say about this too, but I think the truth is all of the big tech companies that we can think of off the top of our heads, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon Web Services, etc. A lot of their headquarters are based in the Gulf region. And I think that speaks a lot, like that says a lot. I only wish they could move to other areas, but the truth is that what is first in their minds is making sure that they have a user base, they have data to harvest from individuals, and if that means sharing that data with the government, then well, that's too bad. Oh, man. UN guiding principles are wonderful, and I'm sure they would be able to guide the work of these companies. And I know a lot of individuals that do work in these companies that are fighting really difficult battles internally to do that. But the reality remains is that is not happening today. That is not the kind of relationship that we see. Unfortunately, we're not seeing tech companies stand up for what's right, stand up for human rights. And at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, is it the companies that need to do that, or do we have to have elected representatives that protect the rights of the people they govern?
Great, thanks, Wafa. Yeah, Ramy.
I would like to go, I have some thoughts that came to my mind. On one hand, I think sometimes we expect too much of tech companies or from commercial companies like Facebook.com, Twitter.com, they're all commercial companies for business. And sometimes I think we over expect what we need from them. I think on one hand, it's good to remember that these companies don't have an official representation in our region, in the MENA, in Egypt or other countries, which means there are no official communication channels going on, such as the ones between the US and Facebook, or between Ireland and Facebook, and so on. And this establishment and presence has a huge impact on how the companies and the state control the content. That's one thing. On the other hand, if you look into all of the transparency reports from Facebook, Twitter, Google, when it comes to Egypt, the number of legal requests, the number of official requests is 0, and the number of official responses and on a number of legal responses are also 0. At the same time, Facebook is still the highest platform in Egypt where people are being targeted and being arrested on, which means the companies, instead of investing not only into human rights regulations, but into their own security and privacy to support the people who are using these tools to become more secure and safe, is the priority from my point of view. Hacking into Facebook accounts, recovering different content from different platforms is very easy. The security and privacy safeguards are not sufficient enough, which would enable states like Egypt and other countries to easily maneuver around different safeguards. Even if there is no official collaboration between Facebook and Egypt, the question is, does really Egypt need this collaboration? In my opinion, it doesn't need this collaboration. On one hand, Egypt owns the infrastructure. Egypt runs many ISPs. Everything happens through their own infrastructure. So the level of collaboration with international companies like Facebook or Twitter is not really necessary, and they can achieve the goal through much shorter and cheaper and easier and national techniques.
Noura or Khadeja, would you like to weigh in on this? I know you've also been looking at the role of the private actors from different perspectives as well. Would you want to add to what Wafa and Ramy have suggested here?
Yeah, sure. I think I just want to build on all what Ramy and Wafa said, and just pay the attention to the geopolitics of the conflict in the region. Probably in the meantime, Facebook doesn't have a quarter yet in Egypt, but we need to consider also that because of the regime of Egypt has alliance in the region, and we know that in other, whether in the Egyptian context or in any other context in the region, we have seen that the Gulf states are conducting some surveillance operations on behalf of these regimes. As an example, the hacking and the phishing attack on the activists from Yemen. The digital surveillance technology has been provided to some local militias by the UAE to some local militias in Yemen, and so on. So I know that it's quite complicated, but there is a lot of concerns about what's going to happen in the future. We've been observing that in some countries there is huge efforts to regulate the data protection law and so on. And here I wish that Wafa has more time to reflect on that. And there's a lot of private sector companies are motivated to open their headquarters and to start working in the region. Here we need independent entities, more civil society involvement in the documentation of any kind of violation, because that having these private sector companies would start to comply with the state's requests, it would be like a very serious issue once we don't have rule of law in the region and we don't have independent organizations and entities to monitor what's going on and monitor the implementation of all of these issues. On the other hand, I want to talk more about the I don't know if we have enough time, but also about the responsibilities of the private sector companies who are selling the digital surveillance technology to these authoritarian states under the like trying to legitimate these violations and saying that we are selling these technology to states to carry out operations of counterterrorism. And we all know that the authoritarian states have like a wide definition of the terrorism. Civil society considered as terrorist entity, independent journalists, and any kind of party of any kind of like activism might be considered as terrorism by these states. And here where is, I think, the importance of moving forward and to also like think about how we need to put extra efforts on these companies, because we cannot let it go by like this. And it's not only about the social media companies, but on the other hand, it's about these companies who are selling, producing and selling the spyware and digital surveillance technology.
Yeah, I want maybe if I could stick with that point for a second, Noura, before I ask Khadeja the same question about the private actors. But Noura, from your perspective, and obviously because there's so much evidence of the use of private surveillance tools and technologies across the MENA region, and particularly the use, of privately available. It's been made relatively inexpensive for governments to use these technologies that are more or less off the shelf. What do you think that states and activists outside of the MENA region should be doing in order to restrain that kind of technology, whether it's its use or its sale or something? Is there a particular policy that you think should be adopted by foreign governments in the region to deal with that threat?
Yeah, definitely. Since all of these companies have like headquarters in different, whether in the US or in the EU, so we can think about how there's more regulation to regulate and to control the export of the digital surveillance technology. I think your work, I'd like to encourage you to talk more about your amazing work. And also here, I want to highlight the amazing efforts by the collective efforts by WhatsApp, Facebook, Access Now, and other actors in the lawsuit on NSO. We know that there's a lot of barriers, but on the other hand, it's just a drop of hope, and we need to move forward. But please, David, talk to us more and take just another role here, because what you've been done and what has been done is very important. We know that this cyberspace is a regulated space, and there is a lot of efforts, but it takes time. On the other hand, we need to keep moving forward and addressing all the challenges and barriers, and have more collective efforts to move forward.
Yeah, well, I thank you. I mean, I don't want to step into being a panelist here, but just to emphasize this point that, I think that one of the things we've seen over the last several years in terms of the role of private actors and these really, nefarious actors that are selling technology without any export control or very limited export control, but also very limited oversight domestically, really suggests that we need an international framework to control certainly the export of the technology, which frankly isn't where we really want to be, right? We'd rather be in the space of constraining the use, but as I think you've all been describing, the governments are using technologies without any constraint, and it's very difficult to push them, to force them to act within a rule of law framework. It actually goes to one of the questions, and maybe I can kind of direct this to Khadeja as well, as you're thinking about this particular issue of private actors. Somebody mentioned the question or raised the point that in a way, there's a kind of breakdown between thinking of things as digital and physical. I mean, much of what you're all describing is in part the result of digital attacks. So surveillance leads to physical consequences, detention, physical attack, and so forth. And I'm wondering, in that environment where the offline harm, let's say, is so real in so many of the different places that you've all mentioned, what is the responsibility of the companies to deal with that? Do they have a particular responsibility? And we see this actually, and I don't mean to extend the question too much, but there was a story in ProPublica yesterday about Facebook's work in Turkey, and I think it's a very complicated issue for many of the companies that want to provide space for expression and yet face these kinds of threats that put individuals at real harm. Khadeja, if I could ask you that, and sort of to bring this broader question of the private actors into view, how do you react to that kind of problem?
I mean, it's a very annoying problem because Facebook is in the US, so it answers to, I guess, Congress and American laws. And those are the only laws that it kind of really pays attention to. And there's like a joke between like MENA online researchers that if you really want to have like some action on your case, get it in the New York Times. If it's not in the New York Times, then you might as well just give up, which is like, what, really? So you really have to like use your whole network to basically get a story in American newspaper or magazine or website, and it doesn't have to. It has to be like the big ones for like tech company comms to be like, let's do something about this, which is very annoying. So it's like why I think they have a huge responsibility, because in some places the governments are going to act against the people, and the governments aren't. They might want these certain activities to go on, so they're not going to raise an issue with Facebook. And I agree with Wafa as well, especially for North Africans, like we feel marginalized in that all of the regional tech companies have their bases in Dubai, which is like at times the political positions of those host companies are against the benefit of the country. So how can you raise something with the MENA office, which you always get given, like talk to the MENA policy team when they're based in Dubai? How can you have sensitive conversations with those people when they're based in Dubai, and you can assume kind of like surveillance and whatnot, whatever you say is probably recorded? Or can you even trust those teams? Do they even have power? How can you actually reach the HQ or the decision makers that actually make the choices? And I think the second thing is a lot of these tech companies are focused on countering terrorism, or they're focused on the violence aspect. So anything that doesn't hit that line of what they'll do to change something kind of like is not a priority. So what do you do? Where do you go if your issue, which is really important and could endanger somebody's life, doesn't hit those kind of like really narrow policies that exist? And I think I don't treat them as like a private company. You're offering kind of like the structure for all of these acts to go on and like make people's lives worse. So you have a responsibility to basically do something about it. I also want to raise something else, in that a lot of the power in this space is focused on American institutions and American organizations. So if you're not well connected in the region, you end up emailing 20 people to basically get a case out there. And I think Wafa might be able to talk about this more, but the case of the Tunisian Facebook pages that got removed, and then they were just going around in circles to try to see what the reason was that they got removed. There's a lot of access issues. There's a lot of like privileged ability to reach people, decision makers that can actually make these choices and get you somewhere, and the access to the media system that these tech companies actually listen to. And it just goes with that our region, or the Arab online space, isn't really a priority apart from kind of like getting the user base. Like one of the panelists said, like, so I think there should be more emphasis on having more contact with people on the ground, researchers on the ground, and have them in these decision-making spaces, away from influence and away from kind of like the huge states that actually want to influence in their favor.
So that's really interesting, and I want to maybe ask Wafa if she wants to add anything to that, but maybe I can start with a question that focuses a little bit. You know, this is a panel about kind of 10 years after, and 10 years ago, I think there was a sense, and the popular perception is of an Arab Spring, right? Which doesn't mean an Egyptian Spring or a Tunisian Spring. It was regional, and there was a sense, I think, at that time of kind of regional solidarity and connection among activists. I mean, Wafa and Ramy know that I've been particularly interested in this question. Does that kind of transnational, and Khadeja, your comment suggests this still exists, but does the kind of transnational solidarity, and not just solidarity, because I imagine the solidarity feeling still exists, but is the collaboration across borders still available to people? Does that exist, or have the results of the last 10 years, which involves repression state by state, with a couple of exceptions, but real deep repression, has that served to kind of undermine the ability of people to communicate across borders, share ideas, do shared advocacy that's regional? But maybe, so that's my question, is about the activist community and the security and digital rights community. But I don't know if Wafa, if you wanted to respond to the point that Khadeja raised, and you could start us off on this.
Sure. Your question, David, is, I would say, a difficult one to answer. I would say that, from my perspective at least, the quest for having human rights and for being free is naturally a shared quest. It's a thirst. And I think that solidarity will always exist. But time and time again, we see authorities that try to divide this feeling. And the expression of that solidarity as such is then encounters quite a few obstacles, whether it's through organizing or through publication of a variety of different pieces and intellectual collaboration. So it's a lot more difficult now, I would say. I just to quickly mention, though, there is a lot of work that is being done outside of those countries by communities that are in exile or immigrant communities that have now founded, beautiful hubs of activism that do exist with a very strong heart. And so that's to answer your question. But I wanted to kind of go back to the idea that, 10 years later, what has changed? So 10 years later, the region has changed. The geopolitics have changed. The individuals who are involved in this activism have also changed, because now a lot of the people that were involved 10 years ago now have families and perhaps, are doing something else. And so that has changed. But what has also changed are the companies themselves, right? When we talked about companies and what they're prioritizing, I think back in 2010, the emphasis on monetization of data and the harvesting of data was not nearly as strong as it is today. And we see this being much more pronounced globally, not just in the MENA region. And this obviously reflects then on how these companies behave in those respective countries. And Khadeja mentioned the case of the Facebook pages being taken down in Tunisia. That's only one example. I mean, another great example of this, and that demonstrates how much more sophisticated, I would say, the debate on the role of companies and the role of the users or the activists who are using the internet it's just so much more sophisticated in the United States and Europe because of that ability to express the main issues and because of what the companies are focusing on too. I mean, like Khadeja said, they're not very interested in the MENA region, whatever they say. I think a great example of that is when the latest presidential elections in Tunisia happened. We, at the time, this is, I think it was only the second presidential election that was no, the third, I think, that was free and fair. And we were still trying to concretize these gains that we've made and being able to elect a candidate. And obviously, I mean, one of the questions you then start to ask is, okay, so social media is being instrumentalized to such a degree by these candidates. We would like to know who's paying for the ads and who's behind advertising on social media. And at the time, Facebook opened up their ad library to, I think, 5 different countries, including the US, Australia, France, the UK, I guess, and one more. And none of those countries were Arab countries. And when at the time when I was at Access Now, we wrote an open letter that was signed by a lot of different organizations that said to Facebook, hey, you're opening up the ad library to other countries and users that are located in those countries. Why don't you open it up to Tunisia? I mean, this is a country that is, concretizing its revolutionary gains, et cetera. I mean, we did all the messaging right. It's just we want to be able to have accountability, transparency. Transparency for voters, and that fell on deaf ears. I mean, it just nobody responded. There was very little that was done, and that was very, very disappointing. I mean, it's you're trying here to and I keep mentioning Khadeja, but we're both from the same region, and she can perhaps talk a little bit more how the cyberspace in Tunisia during those elections was I mean, we talk about contested cyberspace. That was a very contested terrain. And there is evidence of some sort of foreign influence or types of influence that is not organic in those elections. And so, then you start to question, I mean, are the tech companies behaving one way in the global north and behaving another way in other countries that just don't matter? I mean, they're just harvesting data there with no strings attached. They have plenty of users. For a lot of users in Tunisia, when you say internet, they say Facebook. So, I mean, I think there is a responsibility there.
Yeah, would anyone like to respond to any of that? And maybe if I could ask the question in a focused way, just to give us the example of Egypt. If Ramy, if you could talk to this a little bit. I mean, your colleagues in Cairo and across the country have been under enormous pressure for the last 10 years, but certainly over the last few months. And much of that has been basically offline pressure. I mean, it's not, although it's been related to Mada Masr, so it's been about journalism and it's been about EIPR and activism. What in the face of that kind of repression, what's the response that you think, and it doesn't have to be just the company's response because this is much broader, but what should the response be to these repressive actions against freedom of expression, of core rights to protest and activism and so forth? What should be the response of the outside world, those who have the ability to put some pressure on the government?
When I think of this question, and we usually think of this a lot with activists from different countries and different regions, how people can help and how can people collaborate together. I have 2 things in my mind. One is for people and activists and journalists who are living in Europe or who are European, I highly encourage you to use Freedom of Information Act's FOIA request to put pressure on your own government to release data to eventually help us. The best way to help anyone is to put pressure on your own government. That's the fastest and the shortest route. And since we don't have access to information in Egypt and we don't have access to budgets or information or export and import license, this bunch of information could be released easily from Europe through FOIA requests. And we have seen over the past 6, 7, 10 years, many NGOs and journalists have took the initiative to FOIA their own state to release information that would change our understanding of surveillance or change our expectations of how hacking happens in specific regions. And the other thing is, it's important to remember that solidarity is always developing and solidarity is always happening in different ways. And I didn't feel at any point that people lost interest in each other's cause. Maybe we're all suffering in different ways. Maybe we're all exhausted after years and years of problems and so on. But when something bad happens to someone and you would see an immense response in solidarity with them, it really does help a lot, and it uplifts people's energy and mood, and it does get people out. And I think this solidarity campaign with EIPR over the past 4 months is a good example of that. On one hand, the military and the state had never expected such response from the international community with the EIPR, and it proves that solidarity and collective action does help people eventually.
Great. I think that's really concrete advice for people, particularly for people who are listening or watching from outside the region. Would anyone else, would Khadeja or Noura, would you like to respond to either the question of, you know, what's available to outsiders to do to engage in this space, whether it's you're with a government or you're within civil society or you're within a company? What are the steps that you think should be taken?
Yeah, again, I think that we're back again to the talk about the transnational advocacy and transnational activism. Definitely, we need to talk about the power of the transnational advocacy, and I've been monitoring a lot of collective efforts, not only across the region or the diaspora communities from specific country, but I think that now, since many of the activists are acting from the exile, there is more space now for collective efforts, which is and somehow we've been witnessing such amazing efforts. But I want to emphasize also on the transnational digital repression and the potential risk on these communities. I've mentioned that the digital threats might consequence, and we said many cases, might consequence physical threats. So we need to address exactly with the hosting countries and with the diaspora communities also, and with the international and the UN entities about the importance and the need to protect these diaspora communities in order to protect the efforts of democracy and protecting the activism towards the democratic transition in the region. It's very important. It's something I think that I know that we are all more motivated to talk about the protection and the importance to protect people back home, but also we need to make sure that without protecting the diaspora communities in their hosting countries, they won't be able to move forward in their transnational advocacy and transnational efforts. We need to address that the hosting states are responsible. Justice and accountability should definitely take place. And I know that not everything about the transnational digital repression, but also there is a lot of means of global traditional repression. There is some space of hopes. I think two weeks ago there were an Iranian diplomat who was charged in Belgium, and some offensive operation was he was planning to conduct again, targeting the rally of the Iranian opposition in France. So we have some cases we can build on and we can move forward, but keeping silent and also turning all of our efforts to protect people back home without paying any attention to the importance and need to protect people in the exile. It's not good strategy. And also we need to remember all the time that any digital attack on the diaspora activists might reveal the network and might harm people back home in a serious way.
Great, thanks, Noura. So we have about 10 minutes left, a little less than 10 minutes. And so I think it'd be really great if we, as we sort of head towards conclusion and to wrapping up, to think maybe in terms of solutions, or at least to sort of end on a high note, on a positive. And you know, all four of you are deeply involved in regional activism, but also regional activism that's very much connected to the international activism. And so I think you all have remarkable insights into what organizers are doing, how people are mobilizing, and so I want to give you each a moment or two, a couple of minutes if you want, to think about, like, as you are a participant and an observer of this space, what are people doing and what should they be doing within the community of activists and organizers? Like, what is one or two things that you see that's really positive about the nature of activism online today? I mean, focused in particular on the MENA region. That's sort of a broad question, but and you can tackle it however you want. But as people leave this panel, you know, what would you like them to take away in terms of sort of the positive solutions that might be available in order to address digital rights, online security, and so forth? And Khadeja, maybe I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, I'll start with something that, although I know it's like the fact that I've seen Libyans, or maybe I guess actors in different countries, isolated and kind of like really focusing inwards to their struggles. And I've seen a phenomena on Clubhouse, and I know I'll caveat it with Clubhouse is not secure, and we really we should, I mean, for security reasons, should we be having these conversations there? But like, the model has kind of like opened my eyes to seeing people from Libya go into rooms from people talking about Yemen, and kind of like have a virtual room together where they can learn. And I know that sounds a bit cheesy and like romantic and up in the clouds, but I was in a room with Yemeni women talking about the peace process and how they've been excluded from the peace process. And I was like, oh wow, that's the exact same scenario that we have in Libya, and having it be a checklist. And like, disregarding that it's on Clubhouse, I think we should probably have another safe, secure space to have these conversations. But the model is amazing, and it brought back the early days of 2011 Twitter, where you're like, oh, this is so nice, like people talking to each other and not trolling each other, or setting like bot attacks on them. And it was just that refreshing new feeling that kind of energizes you and makes you want to organize and collaborate and communicate with people beyond your borders, that I feel like we could really use more of 10 years later, where we're all exhausted and like cynical about stuff. Yeah, so that's kind of like my 2 cents.
Great. Ramy, are you gonna build that secure space for us?
Nothing happens in a solo fashion. It's all a teamwork and a collective effort. I think as a closing remarks, it's important for us and for everyone who's watching us to remember that no matter which country and which region you're coming from, if you look deeply down, you will find that our struggles are common. Our problems are the same. Our needs are the same. Our human rights problems are happening more or less in different ways. And also our tactics and resistance are inspired by each other. So we help each other out in learning and trying and adapting. And maybe I'm from Egypt, maybe someone is from Brazil or Johannesburg or from anywhere else, but our human rights needs are the same and the problems are the same. And the tactics deployed by the adversary, from cyber attacks to physical attacks, are the same. It's the same playbook being used everywhere. I know we don't have a happy space of work that we can point every day new success stories, but the change is happening. And if you look today, where are we standing from 10 years ago? In my opinion, things are improving, even if tiny bits. the problems are changing, and our tactics are also evolving. Don't give up. Don't give up hope. There are many things that people could be doing from any country in the world, and most importantly, keep up using free and open source technologies, and encryption is working out there. So, yeah.
Great, Ramy, thanks for that. Noura, how would you answer this? What in that like positive, forward-looking approach?
Yeah, I'd like to conclude with the since many of the states in the region are now in the process of so-called transition or whatever, we need to like put more efforts on the all parties and actors in any conflict to adopt privacy and digital rights in the constitutions, and make sure that we have all tools and all practical framework in place, because unfortunately in many countries, including the Syrian process of transition, nothing about the human rights and digital rights have been said about it during the course of the transition or constitutional talk. So it's super important, and again, as civil society organizations and as activists from the region, we need to collaborate more, and we need to think about how to address the digital rights in the transition of each state in the country.
Great, thank you, Noura. And Wafa, you get the last word. I mean, you've been active at both, sort of the grassroots level and the the level of the WEF. So you've seen all of that. What's your take? How would you answer this question of sort of a forward-looking solutions orientation?
I would just say, like Ramy said, don't give up hope. I would encourage more collaboration between technologists and activists and lawyers as well to continue that, because we have a lot of great technologists and great initiatives that happen locally in the region. To also not be distracted, because in some countries there's a lot of focus on the social aspects of social media and Instagram, nice colors and design. And oftentimes we forget the fact that every technology is political, and just to remember that the tools you're using are political. And finally, yeah, just remember that there are some individuals that are still being arrested for posting something on Facebook. We see this happen, for instance, in Algeria all the time. So keep that in mind as well. It's not all sophisticated spyware. Sometimes it's very, very basic still. So, but yeah, let's not give up hope.
Great. Wafa, Noura, Khadeja, Ramy, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to May El-Sudani, who, with the Tahrir Institute, put together this fantastic group, and want to thank you, May, and allow you to conclude.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And thanks so much to everyone for this conversation. As we wrap up, I just want to, again, thank you, express my gratitude to this panel. It was such an interesting, dynamic conversation, and there's so much to unpack, but you guys did a phenomenal job with the hour and a half that we were given. I know we could talk and talk for days. You addressed a lot of the challenges, but you also talked solutions, which I very much appreciate, particularly 10 years later. So thank you, Khadeja, Ramali, Noura, Aljizawi, Wafa, Ben-Hassine, Ramy, Raoof, and David. Today's conversation, as you may know, was hosted as part of TIMEP's project, 10 Years On, Organizing in the MENA region, which works to create a platform for those who have organized, are organizing, and will organize on the ground, online, and in exile and diaspora. I encourage everyone to visit our website for more information. And also, if you're keen, submit a pitch for the project. We are inviting discourse from all across the region and around the world. To our audience, thank you for your insightful questions. We look forward to hosting you once again. And to the TIMEP team working behind the scenes that made this event possible, as always, thank you. And I will end there. Everyone have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.